good evening and welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We'll do a proper round of introductions in due course. Just to introduce myself, I'm Ben Williams. I'm the Programme Manager for Naturehood, and I'll be doing the sort of comparing role, taking the questions, allocating them out around our panel, and hopefully generally keeping things moving. As a lot of people have cottoned on to the fact, the chat function is open. We're using the webinar format, so your webcams and microphones won't get through to us, but you can post questions and comments in the chat function. We've had a huge response from our Facebook people, so we've already got loads of, I know, well, you know, as I say, how many times do I get to pull on a tux in lockdown season? So we've had some really great photos come in beforehand, which has given us some good structure to it. But yeah, by all means, if you've got queries, comments, follow-up, stick them in the chat. Alice is working tirelessly behind the scenes, and she'll be sifting through your comments and feeding them through to me. So if at any point I sound like I'm together, intelligent, well informed on the subject matter, you can guarantee it's Alice in the background. Just a bit of background information. Naturehood is a project, a program run by Earthwatch Europe. Earthwatch is an environmental charity with science at its heart, and we drive the change needed to live within our environmental means and in balance with nature. Primarily, we do this by connecting people with nature, by monitoring the health of our natural resources, and through informing the actions that are going to have greatest impact. Naturehood is one such initiative focusing on biodiversity. This webinar is it's the second one of our sequence of larger scale events, and we're going to be carrying that on through the months and years to come, every couple of months or so, giving us a chance to have a bit of a deeper dive into a topic as they come along. I think that's enough padding for the intro. So once again, welcome to everybody who's joining us, and thank you very much for giving up your evening to come along. We've got an hour and a half on the slot. Hopefully we'll cover a lot of good bases between now and then, but let's crack on. In terms of house rules, there is really only one, and that's keep it clean and civil, please. These are family events. There are young ears or eyes, as may be, in the chat, so do please keep it polite and respectful to people. But that's about it. I would now like to hand over, and maybe if we start with Chloe to do the panel introductions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give a quick introduction to Froglife and then myself, and then I'll hand over to Emily and Kes. So I work for Froglife, so does Emily. We are a national wildlife conservation charity concerned with the conservation of the UK's reptiles and amphibians and their habitats. Our vision is a world in which amphibian and reptile populations are flourishing as part of healthy ecosystems. Our staff deliver conservation and education projects across the UK, and our holistic approach to nature conservation means we can take people on a wildlife journey whilst delivering amazing results for amphibians and reptiles. I am the Sussex Green Pathways Project Officer, and I work with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and special educational needs in outdoor spaces, doing a range of conservation activities. And now I'll pass over to Emily.
Hello, so I'm Emily. I'm the London Tales of Amphibian Discovery, or TOAD for short, project manager. So my project covers everything within the M25, doing everything from pond creations, pond restorations, through to teaching within schools. And one of my personal favourite things to do, which is going out into allotments and teaching there about wildlife-friendly gardening. So yeah, you can find me pretty much anywhere within that M25, talking to someone about toads, which is wonderful. I'll pass over to Kes.
Hi everyone, I'm Kes. I work at Earthwatch Europe in the science team, and I'm the research assistant on the water team. So I mainly work on a project called Freshwater Watch, which is all about getting volunteers and everyday people looking at water quality. So I'm an aquatic ecologist by trade, and have a little bit of an interest in water chemistry, chemicals that get into water and those kind of things. So that will be how I'm contributing tonight.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. And I'm sure you'll agree we've got a really good cross section of backgrounds and expertise in here, which is a good job because we've got a really big cross-section of questions to answer as well. I've just had a note that at the moment your chat settings default to only go to the panelists. So if you want to have a chat and bring other people into the chat, then you can change the settings in your chat box to message everyone. So if you do that, then that'll be great. But let's get into the guts of the subject matter. We all know that we're here because we're interested and enthusiastic about ponds. So the purpose of this evening is to really explore that. Why are ponds important? How can we get the best impact for the pond that we've got in our space? And let's talk about some of the issues, complications and complexities that can arise when you're talking about ponds. As I mentioned, we've had a huge number of questions come in, and a lot of them are about how do you manage a pond over the long term, but we'll start off at the ground level, so to speak, on creating a pond. And maybe, Kes, you were the last ones of the introduction, so I'll give you the first one of the questions. But what are your top 3 things to think about when you're planning a pond?
So I think it depends a bit on what you're looking to have your pond for. I'm going to do a bit of an assumption that you're interested in wildlife. So I think the first things you need to think about are making sure that the species that you put in, if you're putting in any species yourself, are native. So if you're going to be planting up your pond, which I'd say is a pretty good idea to get yourself started, make sure that you're using native species. There's a really good link on the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust website, which I can share with everybody, that has a really good list, simple list of top UK native species that you can use in your pond. The next thing is probably water, making sure that your water's from a good source. It's best to try and use rainwater if you can, or if not, leave tap water out for a few days to let some of the chemicals come off, or there's some special cleaning things you can get using for aquariums to make tap water safe for wildlife. And top 3, so another one would be to, I'd say, enjoy what you have coming to your own pond. So don't worry too much about what things you might get, but try and enjoy the pond that you have and make sure that you enjoy all the wildlife that comes to your pond.
Brill, thanks, Kes. You've done a fantastic job as well of reminding me of something else that I should have said when I started, is that this session is going to be followed up by an email, which will pick up all the links and references that people are talking about. So don't feel that you have to be frantically scribbling around throughout the session. We've got another fantastic guy, James, lurking in the background. His job is to pick up all the useful information. So this will all be followed up. The session is being recorded and be available on our social media channels. So you really don't have to worry about capturing everything. Just sit back, relax and enjoy the conversation, really. Thank you for those. So we've got the species, the water, and just generally enjoy what you get. We'll have a good chance to go down those rabbit holes in a lot more detail later on. But maybe, Chloe, do you want to follow on from that?
Yeah, that's fine. So in terms of building your pond and where you should put it, my kind of top 3 would be, if you can possibly have a pond with a depth of at least 60 centimetres, that's fantastic. It protects our amphibians from the extremes of weather. And in terms of catering as well from amphibians as you can, a 1 to 2 metre diameter is good, but any size of pond is great. You know, adding water to your garden is fantastic. And a good amount of sun on your pond, especially in early spring. So frogs prefer warm, shallow water to lay their spawn in. So thinking about where you put your pond and not putting it under, say, a really large tree that's going to drop a lot of leaves in it in autumn.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And Emily, your top 3.
Yeah, very, very similar there to Chloe's with that. Yeah, make sure that when you're building your pond, particularly if you're digging it yourself, make sure you have lovely sort of pond shelves within that. So you have one lovely sort of sloping side to allow wildlife to get in and out, but just be aware that if you have a whole variety of different sort of shelves or depths on the sides, that will host a much sort of larger diversity of animals within that space itself. The second, or should I say the third thing, I suppose, to add to that, is go crazy with the shape. By going sort of kidney bean shaped or all erratic in the sort of actual shape of your pond, you're actually creating loads of tiny little habitats. So each little sort of crevice or area might cater to one animal specifically. So go crazy with the way it looks. Yeah, that's how I sort of sum it up.
Okay, that's great. I'm just thinking about some of the things that I've seen going through the chat. Someone's put a thing in saying they're looking to repurpose an old sink into a pond. Is that something that you guys have had any experience with? Maybe Emily?
Yeah, old sinks, or even to the extreme. On one allotment I went, I've visited before, they actually use an old bathtub to do this. They went a bit larger on the size. You can use any kind of resin-based sealant to cover sort of any of the holes that, of course, you don't want your water escaping through within that space. The only thing, again, just to remember when you're putting sort of a butler sink or anything like that in, is just that you've got access, really. So you could just sort of pile up some lovely sort of chunky rocks or something on one of the edges just to allow anything to get in and out. But I think it's a fantastic idea, and it's certainly quite an interesting thing to look at when you visit a space.
It's also a really good idea to build up a slope within the pond. So if you've got a sink with really sheer sides, and say, for example, a hedgehog manages to crawl up the side ladder that you've made, they need help getting out. So if you've built access up to the side of your above ground pond, also make sure that you're building ways for animals to get out of your pond as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And anything to add on that side of things, Kes?
I think these guys covered it, but basically make ponds from anything. Like Chloe said, it's better to add water to your garden than not. So whatever you've got, make ponds from it.
So go on then, pop quiz. I think we've had a black plastic dustbin in the chat as well. We've had sinks, we've had baths. What's the weirdest thing you've ever seen repurposed into a pond? Emily?
Great, that's a great question. I've seen everything from micro ponds, so even using sort of half a bottle, uses tiny little spaces for sort of damselflies or dragonflies or passing bees, but something bigger than that was crazy. We've had wheelbarrows that people have got a bit rusty, so they've sunk them down and turned them into ponds. Wellies, small wellies for tiny ponds. Yeah, you can really get creative.
Cool. Kes, Chloe, have you got anything that you've seen?
Yeah, so somebody from one of my groups recently said, could they dig a baby bath into the floor and use that as their as their way to make a pond? I said, well, if it seals water, that's absolutely fine.
Remove the baby first, I'm guessing. But
I think the child had got too old for the baby bath, and that's why they wanted to repurpose it. So yeah, inventive repurposing.
Yeah, I had one similar to Emily as well. I had a friend who actually made an indoor micro pond from a jar, collecting a few things from their pond, and then put it on a windowsill, and they had all kinds of crazy zooplankton and tiny little critters turning up in it. So it's pretty cool.
So there really is no real bottom end to the scale of how small a pond can be and still be effective. Cool, okie dokie. Just picking up on another thing, you mentioned about a resin-based sealant if you're blocking up plug holes and things like that. And we have had a few questions from people. Sorry, I have slightly annoying habit of batching up questions. So there's are there any particular sealants that you should avoid? We've had people asking, how can you avoid using plastic pond liners and things like that? Obviously, plastic's a very hot topic at the moment. And also, if you add rubber elements for plant holders, like old tires was the example that given, are they going to start leaching things into the water that should be avoided? So in terms of things that we can avoid or minimize negative adverse impacts when creating a pond, Kes, anything on that?
So if I take the kind of making one without pond liners, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. One is if you've got clay soil, or if you can get access to some clay materials, you can make a pond that's lined with clay. That's a really good natural way. And actually those natural ponds where the water can fluctuate quite a lot, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. That's kind of how ponds work. So having a bit of up and down in the water isn't always the end of the world. Actually, you can pigs make really good ponds. So if you've got access to pigs or even geese, there's ways you can make a plastic-free pond with them. But yeah, for people without access to pigs or geese, then clay is a good way to go. For the other ones, I think I'll pass over to Emily or Chloe. They've probably got more experience with making non-natural ponds as well.
You want me to take it, Chloe?
Yeah, go for it, Emily.
Yeah, okay. So going back to sort of the first bit there about sealants, there's quite a few sort of aqua safe ones. So I know commercially you can get quite a lot for actually aquariums in those kind of spaces. They will do the kind of jobs for anything sort of heavy enough to stay within there. Generally sealants, well, if you can, let's say you're on the beginning, the creation, set the sealants and have it completely dried, obviously, before you're adding any water, just so then you're not going to lose anything within that water itself. Generally, once it's filled in there, it doesn't tend to degrade at all. So it isn't something too much to worry about once it's down within the ground. You can do other things. I've seen other people get small bits of liner, if you prefer not to use a sealant, to cover over sort of any holes within, whether it be a basin, sort of sink, or up to sort of size of a bath. You can use that, but it's just a little bit harder to sort of glue that down. And the last thing you want to do is go through all that effort of creating something and then it leaks. Once you've collected all your rainwater, you've got it in, and now all the water's gone. For the, I think the third question there, Ben, about tyres?
Yeah, rubber elements, will they leach nasties into the water?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because I think it was, God, maybe in the chat, Ben will pull up the right paper for this, but I believe it was back in 2014 or something like that. There was a whole sort of paper and article series through National Geographic looking at tyres and sort of the amount the microplastics pollute sort of any form of water systems, whether that be found within the sea or any fresh water. Generally, that paper's talking about whilst the tyre's in use. And of course, you're not making a pond whilst the car's in motion. It's beyond that point. That's where most of those microplastics have been sort of found from the rubber. Rubber in general is a tough one. So traditionally, when we only used natural rubber, that's absolutely fine, eco-friendly to have within space, but lots of sort of car tyres now are made sort of from a percentage of natural rubber and a percentage of synthetic rubber. The synthetic rubber can, over time, leach sort of chemicals into your pond. This is long term, though. I wouldn't worry too much about it per se, but just to be mindful of. I know one of the other questions that's submitted asked about the little sort of pots as well, rubber pots for planting. Those generally are made out of natural rubber, so you've not got anything at all to worry about there. But there are plenty of positives though with tyres, because we've used them before to create tiny bog gardens, or you could even create a pond out of a tyre if you sort of staple a liner around it and hold it in. So there's pluses and negatives, and certainly using that is a fantastic way if you've got them about and you just want to add water to your garden. By all means, adding it is still better than having none around. I don't know if anyone has anything to add on that side of it.
I think that seemed pretty thorough, so unless Chloe or Kes have got something burning to add, I'll take us on. Next one, pumps, filters, fountains. How do we sort of see those impacting on a pond? Do you need a pump? Do you need artificial filtration? Would maybe a fountain be a deterrent to wildlife? Chloe, any strong views from you on this one?
So I would say you can have a pond either with a filtration system or without one. You can get lots of plants that will oxygenate the water and and filter things kind of through natural processes. So don't kind of think pond, I must have a filtration system. It's very kind of think that when you've got a lot of fish in your pond, but fish aren't great in a wildlife pond. I'd imagine Kes or Emily might have a little bit more detail on that, but that's the kind of headline thing, is you don't need one. There's lots of other ways to make sure that your water stays healthy.
Cool. Just to mention, by the way, we will be going down and focusing a lot more on plants and animal life in ponds a bit later on. So don't worry if you're not getting that question answered yet. We will get to it. Kes, anything to add from you on the subject of sort of water features and things?
I mean, personally, for me, it's like a fun challenge to make a pond that works. It's its own kind of mini ecosystem without having to add anything extra. Also having filtration and pumps and stuff, that's obviously you've got to hook it up to some kind of electricity, have all those systems, it's extra cost, slight environmental impact, but probably not huge depending on what one you're using. I think it's just more fun to use to go without. I don't know if the noise would impact on any wildlife. I don't know if there's been any studies on that you've heard of, Emily, but I haven't seen anything specific. But yeah, I'd say just try and have fun with making it work without one if you can, but no harm.
Cool. Anything from you on that one, Emily, rather?
No, agree with exactly what both of you said there. The only other caution ever to think about with filters or anything like that is, or fountains particularly, the amount of sort of surface disturbance. If it's got a particularly heavy flow, just be aware that might slightly mess up any aquatic invertebrates and their natural behaviours. But generally they'll be fine if that's within the pond, but you definitely don't need them. Just as Chloe said, they tend to be marketed mainly for ornamental fish and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Okie dokie, thanks. And sorry this hit your watch, Emily, but just as another point, if we are talking about terminology, if we can try and make the language a bit accessible as well. So when we talk about aquatic invertebrates, we're really talking about bugs and creepy crawlies,
sorry,
things like that. So it's not a big problem. Like I said, we do want to stay true to the science and the understanding of this, but if we do descend into jargon, I'll probably pull you back and ask you to clarify a few terms. I want to ask one question about raised ponds. Perhaps if you're worried about very small children, or if you've got someone in your space who's got an access requirement. Emily, you've been telling Charlie for the last couple, so I'll let you introduce this answer. Raised ponds.
Yeah, raised ponds can be great. So actually one of our other projects at Froglife, there's one called Come Forth for Wildlife based up in Falkirk in Scotland. They do lots of ponds in and around sort of primary schools, and raised ponds often are one of the ways they get around this. You can easily make them to access for wildlife. So when you put the pond in, depending on whatever height of course you want, you build that on one side, but then you can almost build up a ramp with any form of sort of soils or anything like that at the back. So maybe you've got the people side of the pond where you can all sort of stand or be around the front of it, and then the back can be accessed for wildlife. You can do even more fun things with that. I mean, it depends how showy you want to get with your pond, or how interested you are in looking into it. You can even change sort of front panels of raised ponds to be sort of glass, or sort of a sort of flexy sort of plastic on the front, so you can be able to see in and see the life under the surface. There's a lot you can do with raised ponds. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic way forward.
Cool. Anything from Chloe or Kes to add on that one? Certainly I'm hearing don't let it be a barrier to creating a pond.
No, definitely. You can have, like Emily said, you can have lots of different kind of ways to make the sides accessible for people. There is a really good above ground pond. I think it's Langford Lakes, which is a Wiltshire Wildlife Trust reserve. And they've got a bank at the back. They've got like a boardwalk up the side, but they've also got the front of it as a slope like this, so that you can actually tuck a wheelchair in underneath part of it, so that then the wheelchair user's arms would then be kind of above the pond. So if they were pond dipping, they could put a tray there and actually tuck themselves in. So that one's absolutely fantastic. I'll take us on. I can see loads and loads of people asking about plants and weeds and things like that. We just had a couple of very specific ones have come in through the chat. In digging one of our ponds, we've hit blue clay, which I understand is anaerobic. Will this affect the oxygen levels in the water? Anyone care to grapple with that one, Kes?
Yeah, I can take that. So when you're building, hitting clay is kind of, if you want a natural pond, that's not too bad. You're hitting something that, like you say, it's not very soluble, like water's not going to go through it. So what I would do is, when you're digging out, keep some of the soil that you're digging out, and then you can put that back over the top of that clay. Whether or not you put a pond liner or something else in between it is up to you, but make sure that you save some of the other soil to put on top of that, and then you can plant some of the native water plants in there, and that will help with the oxygen levels. So yeah, I wouldn't mind. It's not going to necessarily stir up if you've got other soil and stuff on top, and it's quite like stuck down. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that one too much. It seems like a good thing.
Okay, brilliant. And maybe one for Emily. Any suggestion for an inherited pond with a breaking down butyl liner?
Right, okay. Yeah, so butyl, I mean, it has a shelf life of about 20 odd years. It might be a job if it's breaking down so much so that you can see it's visibly starting to get holes. It might be this coming winter, you might need to drain the pond and reline potentially. If you think it's still got a few years left in it, the best thing to do is potentially have plants or anything around the immediate edge. So if there's any of the liner in direct contact with sunlight, let's say the water level is slightly low and you've got a section maybe always a couple of inches or something like that right on the edge that's always got hot sun beating on it, if you can try and shade off that to slightly protect the liner a little bit. I know some people put sort of marginal, or the plants that are right at the edge of the pond, to have a bit of protection there. But it might be, depending on how old that pond is, it might need a little bit of help this autumn winter time.
Okay, and I've just seen one more structural one pop up before we move on to start talking about plants. Is there any planning threshold for ponds? Is there any size above which you need a planning application?
Want me to take it?
I have no idea, so yeah,
I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, no, sold to Emily.
Yeah, so it depends. It really does depend. So planning permission itself seems to change place by place. So quite a few of the ponds that I've built sort of the past 4.5 years have been around the kind of size of sort of 40 meters by 20 meters. And most of them haven't needed planning permission. Of course, we'll need the landowner's permission, but it will depend on where that is, how it's going to be accessed, and who owns it. Some areas it's the other way around. I've had some ponds that can go in almost like that within a couple of months, and others that have taken a few years of going through the planning. So if you're thinking big, maybe start the ball rolling and ask the questions to your local authority now.
Okay, but I'm guessing the threshold, the bar's set pretty high in terms of size before you're not going to trouble our average. Okay, that's brilliant. I'm going to move on and we're going to start talking about plants and how you manage plant populations. I would like to say a particular congratulations to the person in the chat who's made a mini pond out of a Ferrero Rocher box. Congratulations on achieving the most middle-class mini pond I've ever encountered. So very well done for that. And thank you again for all your questions and answers. So I'm going to move on, again, kick you off with a very, very general question. Which plants encourage wildlife? Chloe, can I start with you on that one?
Well, so basically going for your native plants and having a mixture of plants in your pond, so that you've got ones that are rooted from the bottom of the pond, you've got plants that are floating on the top, and also making sure you've got plants around the edge as well, which will in those shallow areas, so that you've got areas for tadpoles and things like that to hide in. It's really useful to provide kind of lots of plants that will have a variety of cover. And then also making sure that you've got, some plants around your pond, so that when you've got amphibians migrating to and from your pond, there is cover around the edge as well. In terms of actual plants, there are useful native plant lists around. Emily might have a couple of kind of key plants that would be fantastic.
Do you want to pick that one up, Emily?
Yeah, of course. So the first thing I'd say is we have a guide called the Just Add Water Guide, and on page, I think it's 11 or 12, there's a whole list of plants to put in there that also show you depending on size. So if you've only got a little pond, there's certain plants you wouldn't want to touch. But a few personal favourites for wildlife that you might want to spot, particularly of course for me and Chloe, are going to be a little bit biased with the amphibians, of course. Certain things like water forget-me-not or water mint are great for all of our native newt species to lay eggs on. So they're really good sort of plants to begin with for that kind of thing. Marsh marigolds are fantastic for butterflies and bees to be able to access your pond. All the way through to slightly sort of taller plants within the area like brooklime or flowering rush. That's where you tend to find your dragonflies and hoverflies using them. So yeah, I think go just as Chloe has said, go very diverse with it, and yeah, have a play around with what's native in your area.
Cool, thank you very much for that. Kes, earlier on you were talking about there were some things that you can plant up which will actually help manage the water quality. Do you maybe want to talk us through some of those? Please?
Yeah, so to kind of add to what Emily said, those are really great for sort of going round the edges and bits and pieces, and then there's some really good oxygenating ones that you can add to the water. Rigid hornworts are really common one. It's quite easy to get hold of and does a really, really good job of oxygenating the water. There's also spiked milfoil, which is really pretty. It sends up some flowers at some points in the year, and really good oxygenating plant. So like Chloe said, it's really good to have a variety of different habitats, so it's less kind of about the plants, apart from making sure they're native of course, and more about making sure that you're covering the different habitats. And something that's in the water, floating in the water or submerged inside the water, and that can provide habitat and oxygen's really important. So yeah, I'm sure Emily's list is really good as well on the Froglife website, and there's the Wildfowl Wetland Trust has a list of native plants as well.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of links popping up, so thank you for that. A few people asking, is there such a thing as too many plants? Can you overplant a pond? I see a couple of wry smiles developing. Emily, do you want to talk to that one?
Yeah, of course. So generally, what I would aim for in a wildlife pond, particularly a domestic wildlife garden pond, you're looking for about 70% vegetation cover and about 30% open water. That's probably going to be your best kind of look. If you start going a little bit beyond that, there's a process called succession, which is as sort of, it goes from bare rock all the way up to woodland. And I always think of ponds as their dream is to grow up and become a woodland. So if we don't keep on top of the amount of plants, it will start to disappear and turn into something, much more land-based over time. So roughly 70%. I don't know if anyone else would want to add anything to that.
Anybody going to differ with that? Sorry, Claire.
No, not going to differ. I'd agree with that. But I would say there's a difference between having 70% of a variety of plants and 70% of one plant taking over your pond in a very aggressive fashion. So you don't want one particular plant really dominating, especially if it's going to cover, you know, a lot of the surface really quickly and stop the sunlight from getting through down through the water column.
Are there any particular ones that are notable that you might want to avoid, ones that are noted for being quite aggressive and invasive in a pond?
There's quite a few. I can't remember any names at the moment.
We've got a comment on pondweed in the chat, and that's obviously one that people, I don't know how much you want to go into algae and pondweed now, or if you want to save that for later, but that's
So no better time to be talking about algae and pondweed. So you crack on, Kes.
So yeah, there's you might see things like duckweed that are floating on the surface that can get really out of control. And I can see that someone said, you know, shall I take it out? And I think hopefully Emily will agree with me, but it's kind of tricky to completely eradicate something from a pond. And when it comes to that, when you've got one plant that's overtaking everything, it comes down to management, trying to take out as much of that thing that's overtaking as possible, and make sure that you've got other things ready to take its place so that it can have a bit more of a competitive atmosphere to grow up in. That's kind of key, is getting other things in there. But you're always, you know, if you have something that takes over as a problem species, it is very difficult to completely eradicate it. So it's just about making sure that you manage that. And autumn's usually a good time to pull things out, autumn into winter, when things are, you can still see them, they're still there a little bit. But yeah, and if you've got things like duckweed on top, if you've got like a little net or something, you can just like skim over the top, and then just make sure that you just put it on the outside of the pond for a bit, so that any little critters that are living in there can go back in before you clean it up. So
no, that's really good, because we've had a lot of people asking about this kind of maintenance. And would you kind of blitz the entire pond, or maybe do it in sections and rotate around? Is there a rule of thumb for how you go about clearing out some of this vegetation? Emily, any guidance on that?
So just as Kes was saying there, with any of the floating ones, yeah, as much of that off as possible, I suppose, if you've got anything like those pondweeds or duckweeds on top. My only tip with that is, if you live somewhere where it can get quite windy, wait to a nice windy day, because it does a lot of the work for you. So you can scoop up as it goes, and the wind will always push it down one end for you. But that's just probably, I've spent too many times in ponds trying to fight this stuff. So that's something to be aware of. I think some of the other plants that aren't floating and maybe are in there and have been a little bit aggressive, shall we say, in taking over your pond, so yellow flag iris and white water lily, for them, I'd say go quite harsh. I think you can go quite harsh in general with pond plants, and they will bounce back. It's quite incredible, really. You can take it right down to almost the water level in autumn, and by spring you look at it and go, well, I've spent hours in that, or a few days of my life clearing that, and it's come back again. So do go quite strongly with that. I think, was there a question specifically about water lilies? I think
there was one that popped up in the chat a minute ago.
Yeah, I did see something in the chat, and we've got one about where I think someone's inherited a pond with a whacking great chunk of lilies in, and can that be split down, thinned out? Because again, these can be quite aggro as a species, can't they?
Yeah, you're exactly right there. It's another tough one. Try, if you can, break it up in sections. Of course, be aware, especially if you've inherited the pond, make sure if you're going in there with a spade that you know if it's lined or not, because I suppose you don't want the opposite to happen. You remove the water lily, but also all the water. So yeah, break it up for sure. Take it down as low as you can and just take it out section by section. It can be quite heavy work, just because of the water weight you'll get on any of that you're pulling out will be quite heavy. So yeah, it might be a bit of, maybe not the answer you want, but a little bit of time of just trying to hack away at it.
I think elbow grease is the answer to a lot of conservation questions, really. Now, I don't know, we've still got a few algae questions. Suspicious magenta coloured algae on dead leaves. What is it? Is it a risk? Anybody familiar with magenta algae?
There's a few different species it could be. I think when it comes to algae, people tend to panic a little bit. There are some algae that when they grow and get out of control, they create a harmful algal bloom, which can have some toxins in it that can give you a rash or make you sick if you're drinking the water, and they can be bad for animals if you've got animals swimming in or drinking the water. But there doesn't seem to be loads of research on personal ponds. They're more of a problem, I think, in larger ponds, as far as I've been able to find. I don't think they've done loads of studies. So I think, you know, if you've got algae in your pond, if it's not overtaking everything, don't panic too much. And even if you've got like green water or brown water, there's a comment in the chat from Paul about Freshwater Watch and the study that we did on water quality in ponds. And we found that nitrates and phosphates, which are the things that we measure, which are the things that all plants need to grow, but if they get too much of them, they go a bit crazy. They're often actually quite low in ponds compared to rivers and lakes and things. We actually can see quite good water quality in ponds. And the colour of the water isn't always necessarily kind of associated with the health of the pond. If you've got lots of other plants and you've got lots of wildlife and things, I wouldn't worry too much. It's more understanding the health of the pond, and if you've got one thing taking over, that's when you want to start looking at water quality and looking at what other things are going on. There's all kinds of stuff going on at a microscopic level in the ponds, tiny little algae and tiny little creatures that are eating those algae, and for me that's something that's super cool. And that's, like Emily was saying, you know, if you've got a filter, that disturbs all of that activity going on. So, you know, it might make your water clearer, but you're losing some of that fun. Yeah. So I don't know if Emily's got anything to add, or Chloe.
Well, Kes, while you're on the mic, because you've been talking about it, another question: what is algae? How do you recognise algae? Can you just give us a little capsule definition, please?
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult one. Like, science is one of those things where people use these words as kind of like a catch-all sometimes. So you might read stuff in online and it can use algae to refer to all kinds of things, but usually it's not a complicated water plant, so something with leaves and flowers and things like that. It's can either be little floating, so the water's just a greeny color, or it can be kind of like a mat, or like similar to moss. It can sometimes look like a kind of slime. So it's something that's not a complicated plant, that's usually in water. But cool. Yeah, people use it kind of all over the place, so it can get a bit confusing when you're reading stuff.
All right, I get that, bit of a catch-all term. And a couple of people have asked about, are there biological controls that you can add to keep your algae down? People have mentioned snails, or are there specific plants that you can add to a pond which might manage the algae in there? Chloe, is that anything that you're up on?
I'm going to pass this one over if that's okay, because
sure,
although I know a little bit about it, I don't know the right names of things.
So with algae, kind of exactly what Kes was touching upon there about being this sort of really small sort of plant within the water itself. They tend to thrive a lot in ponds that have lots of free nutrients. So the ponds have a lot still to give. I suppose a good biological control for that is you can plant that pond up a little bit more. So marginal plants, so those ones around the edge, sometimes the slightly taller plants, generally what you see around the ponds, they tend to be very nutrient hungry, shall I put them? They'll absorb quite a lot. So actually you can kind of try and get rid of the algae by removing the amount of the free nutrients within the pond itself. So you can try that as your approach. You can plant them around. If you're already feeling like your pond's got a lot of vegetation in it, by all means plant it in aquatic baskets. So you can get them sort of from any kind of garden centre. So you can pop them in to help remove the situation of too many nutrients, and then pull them back out and put them into a different pond later on, if that helps out. I think I saw somewhere as well about barley straw. Barley straw can work. It can sometimes take a little while to kick in within ponds itself. Yeah, it's just it can be an ongoing thing within a pond. So
Okay,
again, just more vegetation.
Yeah, I'm hearing kind of the more free nutrients there are in the pond, the more likely it is that something's going to get out of control. So
Yeah.
try and keep that as a balance, which is great. Thank you very much for that. We are building up in terms of the chat. So can you plant up a pond straight away? Literally fill it up, in go the plants, or does it need to settle and get to terms with itself first? Chloe, anything on that side?
So yeah, you can plant up a pond pretty quickly. Just make sure that if you've, say for example, filled it with tap water, that you've treated the water so that you're reducing the chlorines and things like that. But yeah, as soon as it's in, depending on your season and obviously when those plants are supposed to be planted, yeah, think about it as a start planting and progression kind of throughout the year.
Cool. And you mentioned treating. Is that a little sachet that you drop in? Do you just leave it for a while?
Yeah, so if you fill your pond up with water collected from a water butt, rainwater is absolutely fine. But if you're using tap water, then yeah, you can get just things that you can add to the water that will reduce the number of chemicals in it, deactivate them. Yeah.
Cool. And just to clarify, we're saying collecting rainwater and using that for your ponds and water features is the go-to option.
Yeah, definitely. If you can do that, that is fantastic.
Brill. Okay. In terms of the marginal plants, that's the ones that grow in the shallows and just round the edges. Do those need to be specific pond plants, or can kind of anything that favours wet conditions get on in that? Maybe Kes, do you want to come in on that?
There are quite a wide variety of nature species. I guess Emily was talking earlier about how there's kind of a succession and plants will grow up, and there are ones that like slightly wetter and then going into the drier. So it's quite difficult to kind of really split those lines. So I guess the best thing is to see how wet it is. There are some plants that like having their feet wet all the time, and then other things that can deal with certain amounts of drying out. So it's best to really look at the habitat that you've got. Is it going to be wet all the time? Is it sometimes wet, sometimes dry? Is it just like quite wet soil? And then you can look at which plants are going to grow best there. So it's less about categorizing it as a pond plant or not pond plant, and more looking at the plant itself and what it might like. And I'd say, yeah, go crazy, look at what the plant likes and find out where it's going to grow best and see if it goes there.
Yeah, I guess it's one thing about plants, if they don't like where they are, they tend to tell you about it, really. So
it's also quite useful to have a look at what kind of pond plants are growing in your local areas. If you've got local ponds, to have a look and actually see kind of what the plant variety is, diversity in those, to get a feel for what ponds in your area potentially thrive.
Okay, now there's an interesting follow-on question to that about mixing and matching between ponds, but we'll pick that up when we start talking about frogs and amphibians, which I promise you we will move on to very, very soon. Just a few more quick ones around plants and vegetation. Emily, you were talking about soil and growing media in ponds. There's a question. My pond's about 10 months old. I only planted in pots and containers. Now, how do I get soil into the pond for bottom planting?
Yeah, Aquatic compost, most good retailers that sell any form of garden plants or anything like that should be able to sell you that. That's a good place to begin, at least. And yeah, you should be able to pack it around any plants if you're not trying to basically get rid of any of the aquatic baskets. You should be able to hold it in down towards the bottom. You can also utilize sort of stones for that. Many times we've done, I think, very weird things to keep pond plants in ponds themselves, but you can certainly pack stones on top of where you've just planted that basically just pushes them, keeps them at the bottom until their roots are sort of set in. So I think that's a good place to begin.
And what, if you're doing that, could you just kind of sort of try and take the pond level down a bit so you don't drain it completely, just give yourself a bit more of a working environment and then let it fill back up again?
Yeah, you could do that. Or if you're very keen and you have waders or very large wellies or something like that at home, by all means, you can get in and have a go if you'd like to for that kind of work. Or particularly with your arms going in, I know you can get, I always think it's a funny name to call them gauntlets, but you can get the pond gauntlets or very long gloves and have a go reaching in. But of course, yeah, don't become aquatic or waterborne yourself and fall in unless someone's got a camera nearby, then.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let me just check my magic list. And I think we're about ready. Well, we're about halfway through our slot. So let's get on to the big ticket item. You know, we're all about the animals and the critters and things like that. And you know, again, a huge amount of questions. So again, we will start off with the very general question. The hot ticket question of the moment: how do I attract frogs and other amphibians like toads and newts to my pond? And I think it'd be rude not to ask our Froglife colleagues to kick that one off. So Emily, do you want to run with that, please?
Yeah, sure. So attracting them to your pond is pretty much everything we've talked about, really. We've gone through the creating a pond of the first thing as being the great first start, and then having a wide variety of vegetation around it to make it a nice sort of safe space for them to be able to come through and visit that area. Also thinking a bit about, Chloe touched upon it earlier, about the surrounding area. So think a little bit about the habitats just outside the pond. I always think if you think a bit like a predator, so if you think like a fox or a badger or even a cat near a pond, if you find it hard to see the surface or any ground level, then that's pretty good for an amphibian. They want to stay pretty hidden from most things. So having log piles or long grass next to your ponds is a fantastic way to attract them. But we very much do live by the mantra of build it and they will come. Newts particularly, I won't go into the science, but you can read a lot about it. They sense water by chemical cues. So even a newt passing fairly close nearby may sense you've just put this lovely new body of water in, and they'll find their way there. It's incredible how they do it, but they do.
Awesome, thank you for that. And Chloe, Emily mentioned log piles. And I don't know if there's other sort of outside the pond, are there other things that you can be doing within your space that will increase the chance of a frog or equivalent coming to set up house there?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, log piles, really good. Things like leaf piles as well. Just making sure, like Emily said, you've got a variety of places for them to hide. And most importantly, have a little walk around your garden and make sure that your fencing isn't completely solid. Because amphibians will move away from ponds when it's not spring, when it's not some kind of breeding time. So if you want those amphibians to come towards your lovely new pond, then you need to make sure that they can access it from the surrounding habitat. So that might be through other people's gardens. You might have, you know, some sort of wonderful nature reserve behind you. You never know. Even things like playing fields, you know, they could be on kind of a lot of different areas that might connect with yours. So make sure you've got holes in your fence. And if you know your neighbours, also make sure that they've got holes in theirs. What's a really interesting thing to do actually is to look at your property on Google Maps and think, right, if I had access points in all of my fencing, how many properties could I feasibly link to, and how much area would that actually cover? Because we have a lot of green space locked up in gardens, and it's fine for those you know, birds and flying invertebrates, but it's not so good for things that have to move along the ground. So yeah, thinking about access is really useful.
Fab, thank you for that. And would it be illegal for me at this point not to mention that this is exactly what Naturehood is about? It's about unlocking the potential of these spaces and connecting creating connected communities of wildlife rich spaces. So a lot of you are following us on the Facebook page. We do one thing per week for wildlife about how you can do exactly what Chloe's been talking about and really just start to build up the potential of your space for wildlife. That's my little soapbox moment done. Kes, anything to add on that? How do we attract frogs and other animals?
I've seen quite a lot of comments about various insects and flies and mosquito larvae and things. And I'd say, you know, I'm really keen on all of those things for their own sake. So I'm like, would never say try and get rid of them, but they're also really good food for a lot of things. So, you know, don't despair if you've got lots of insects and things in and around your pond, because that's going to bring other stuff in to eat it.
Okay, brilliant. And suppose I'm a bit impatient, a bit frustrated, and I just want to go and grab a chunk of frog spawn from my neighbour's pond because they've got loads and pop it into mine. How evil am I being when I'm doing that? Emily?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a question we get asked quite a lot, because it always comes from people with the best of intentions. You just want to help that population move around, but please never move frog spawn or tadpoles from pond to pond, because without you knowing it, you could be spreading disease further around. So it could be that frog spawn's been laid, but it all has a certain disease on it, or even non-native plants within that, maybe invasive plants within that pond that then you're lifting up and moving to your pond. So please don't do it. By all means, of course, I will add the one caveat to this, that frogs don't always make the best choices, in that you could have built the most wonderful pond at the back of your garden, the frogs made it to your driveway, and she's just decided, I'll lay my spawn here in a puddle. Now, of course, if that happens, by all means, collect that spawn and put it in your back garden. And the reason why we say that would be okay is just because that female frog is likely to, where she's laid that spawn, she'll be using bodies of water within that sort of surrounding 100 meters. So if she has a disease, she would have spread it there herself, and it's not you doing it. But otherwise, please don't move it around. Yeah, just enjoy it growing where it is.
Okay, that's pretty clear. Are there any legal constraints around that? I mean, obviously we know that some newts are designated and protected species. Are there any things, I think we get the message very clearly, don't move spawn between ponds, but are there any legal constraints that people ought to be aware of? Again, Emily, I'm probably looking at you with that one.
Mm-hmm. So sadly, our legal and legislation that we have in the UK does fall short a bit when it comes to things like this. But yeah, you definitely you shouldn't be moving it around at all. You definitely can't sell it on further on. Lots of the main sort of legislation out there is to prohibit the sale of any wildlife or removing it from the wild for that purpose. You've said the exact same thing there when you're talking about other species. So certain things, if you're very lucky to live near somewhere that has great crested newts, they are a European protected species, and by all means, don't be sort of getting too involved in that pond in the sense of moving anything around or handling them or anything like that, as that could leave you with a bit of a hefty fine in the UK.
And a slightly odd question, maybe one for Kes. What if you have frog spawn but don't actually want it? If you've got different goals for your pond and all of a sudden there's a load of frog spawn in it, do you have any options around that?
Oh, sad days. Why don't you own your frog spawn?
I don't write these.
I think that, you know, people want a certain thing for your pond, but that's not really how, and your garden, that's not necessarily how nature works. Nature decides what's best for that space a lot of the time. And yeah, I'd personally leave it be no matter what. I don't know if Emily has anything she'd want to add, like she said, maybe if there's something else within 100 meters, but yeah, I'd leave it be because it's probably going to be happy there.
Yeah, exactly that. And also, don't ever be alarmed by the amount. I think a really good way or perspective of looking at frog spawn, a female frog will quite happily lay between 2,000 and 3,000 eggs in spring, but it's a ridiculously small number that actually make it into adult frogs. It's about 0.14% that actually make it. So by no means are you going to end up with the collective noun of an army of frogs invading your garden. That frog spawn is so useful for many of the other animals. If you like things like dragonflies, their nymphs certainly consume quite a lot of the frog spawn, so it's really important for other animals there. So don't be too alarmed by having it there.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll be talking a bit more about things that predate on frog spawn and tadpoles a bit further down the track. We've had a number of people saying, because obviously frogs are just about starting to spawn at the moment, but equally we've had a really cold snap. Will that have killed off any new frog spawn potentially? Chloe, anything on that in terms of frost and frog spawn?
Well, they do kind of sometimes lay a bit early, and there are frosts, so it's not always kind of fatal for them. Somebody else might have something else to say about that. I just wanted to quickly pick up on a question that was in the chat that's just popped up, which is, how do you discourage children from taking spawn to study, and that they've got a problem with that in their neighbourhood? Generally, it's great not to remove spawn from a pond. If children really do want to study it and they do take some, making sure that they're raising it in the right conditions, really useful, and putting it back into the pond that it came from when they want to release things, rather than releasing it anywhere else. So, if children really want to do it, you can't stop them. Like Emily said earlier, there's no kind of legal ramifications about removing and moving frog spawn, but just thinking about kind of the journey that it goes on and where it returns to is quite useful.
No, that's great. And obviously, you've got to inspire young minds with something, haven't you? So if you can't go around and do it, but put it back where you found it.
Yeah, just think about how you manage it.
Yeah. Anything more about cold snaps and frog spawn? If you do have spawn in your pond and there is a frost forecast, should we be doing something about it? Is there some way we can protect it, Emily, maybe?
So a few years back, there was of course the beast from the east that laid claim to quite a lot of the UK's frog spawn that year. So there's a few things you can do. It will affect some frog spawn, especially if ponds do freeze. You can collect some of that frog spawn by all means. You can put it into a bucket along with some of the pond water. And if you have let's say a garage or a shed that's slightly warmer than the outside temperature, by all means you can leave it in there whilst that cold snaps basically passes. So return it to that pond a few days later when it's a little bit warmer. You can do that. One caveat with that, I did mention dragonfly nymphs. Just make sure you've not left any predators of that frog spawn in that bucket. Otherwise, you're locking them in with a buffet, and you don't really want that to happen. But you can go down that route. Aside from that, I mean, the top level of the spawn may die. So in those big clumps, we only see sort of the top of what we call a mat, really, when you see it across the top. So that top level may die off, but quite often you'll find the underside of the spawn is still alive and kicking under there. So I wouldn't worry too much with that. I mean, freezing ponds, I don't know if that's a topic we're going on to later. Or do you want me to jump in now?
Yeah, crack on. I think we talked about the depth, obviously, in terms of pond creation, but yes, speak to us about freezing.
Yeah, freezing, of course, in the UK, our lovely weather, it's inevitable. It can happen, as it's a bit crazy at times. To try and stop freezing on ponds, we don't really want them to completely freeze over. So you can float a tennis ball or a football within that pond. It'll keep a lovely sort of pocket of air to allow an oxygen exchange to still happen in the water below. So that's a really good thing to do. And let's say, it happens, let's say you have a pond on your allotment, you haven't been there yet, and it's been very cold and it has frozen. You visited at the weekend, and now you're in the situation where it's just a little block of ice. Please don't sort of break it in the way of like hitting it or any form of impact, as that can stun any sort of, or if you've got fish in there, it will definitely stun the fish. But if it's a wildlife pond, it can certainly stun any amphibians that may be overwintering at the bottom of the pond. But the best way we'd actually say to get rid of that is if you have a nice hot cup of coffee, I'm presuming it'd be cold enough that you might want a hot drink. If you just rest that on the top of the water surface, just to melt away a section. Again, I'd push on the melting it away using sort of just a pan or a cup, and don't pour it straight in, because again, you can put animals into a bit of a shock if you're going from, let's say, -1 to I don't know, 10 degrees. It's quite a jump. That'll certainly wake you up. So yeah, just resting something to slightly melt that ice away. I don't know if others want to add anything to that, but yeah.
Brilliant. Kes, anything on that side of things? Frost, freezing conditions in general?
I don't know if I think we mentioned pond depth already, but yeah, even if you've got a very deep pond, in very extreme conditions, it can freeze all the way down. But so yeah, trying to prevent it as much as possible. But sometimes the weather's just cold. Most of our creatures are well, you know, have some protection against different weather and can go into hibernation and things. But when it's really, really cold, you can't do too much.
Cool. And did I hear that the really important thing is to have at least a small clear space, because that's what allows the gas exchange between the water and the air. So that's the reason why you really don't want the whole lot freezing over, correct?
Yeah, exactly it.
Excellent. All right, we're going to crack on with a few more. I mean, yes, we accept that there's a pretty alarming sort of drop off in terms of frog spawn to adult toad. Are there any particular blights or diseases that can affect frog spawn? We've had one question saying it's gone milky white and not developed. Anything that you're aware of that is a common affliction of frog spawn? Maybe start with Kes on that one and move on to Chloe.
As far as I know, that's just a sign of the frog spawn is sadly dead and isn't going to develop. But like Emily said, that doesn't mean that everything within that clump of frog spawn is not going to develop. So don't remove it. It can also be food for other things. But I don't know too much about amphibian diseases, so I'll pass on to our Froglife experts for those ones.
So I would say that sometimes if your frog spawn is looking kind of milky white or not quite right, I didn't mean to rhyme there, but I did. It could be that the female has laid it and it's unfertilized, so it may not actually be, you know, able to grow into tadpoles anyway. But again, like Kes says, it is useful food for other things within the water column. I'm going to pass over to Emily for things about diseases because she's very good on this.
Yep, so that sort of milky white substance, I mean, it could be a variety of different things, but exactly what both Chloe and Kes have said there. Generally, if the frog spawn itself is white, it tends to be either unfertilized or it sort of is, it's dead at that point. The reason why you tend to start seeing some of it becoming almost cotton-like or sometimes milky white, there's a fungus called don't quote me on the pronunciation of this, I'm a nightmare for it. Saprolegnia, which is just a fungus that basically covers over any of that dead spawn. It just starts to basically consume what's underneath. For that, that's not the reason why the frog spawn's dead. It tends to be that the frog spawn by that point is dead, and that's just what's happening. I think before people have asked, should you remove that? By all means, you can remove that. It will stop the fungus itself moving on, but the fungus tends to only really be attracted to already sort of decaying matter or dead frog spawn per se. A good way actually to tell if something's already dead is you can put your hand into the pond. Again, you could be wearing your pond gauntlet to collect some sort of silt, and if you scatter the silt over the top of the frog spawn itself, if over time it manages to clean itself off, it's telling you it's still sort of live and kicking, whereas if it just basically gathers all of that, it won't move at all. Frog spawn's actually quite wonderful to look into in how it moves all of its nutrients around within there. But if you see it not being able to clean itself, then generally it has deceased. Other diseases, I always think it's such a sad topic to talk about, really. We don't have many native species of amphibians in the UK, but there is quite a lot of diseases that can affect them. So the big players are chytrid. So chytrid is another type of fungus. It's the fungus that's leading to sort of a global decline in amphibians, and it is here in the UK. So there's two types of it. Chytrid BD, which just affects our frogs and toads, and that can kill them. And there's another called chytrid B-Sal, which is a growing concern in the UK, and that's the one that affects our salamanders or our newt species. That's a bit of a worry for us. It's a really nasty fungus. Again, it's probably quite good I don't have slides. It's normally the not suitable for work one that looks horrific, particularly if you're eating. But that's something.
Emily, I think it is a fairly somber subject, and I'm just getting slight nudges that we've still got a fair amount to go through. So if you're all right to kind of pop a bit of a further information link about the sort of the rather unfortunate series of frog spawn based diseases, but kind of, you know, there's such a wonderful world in just in the spawn as well that you've enlightened us to. So thank you for that. Just before we move on to just kind of wider pond ecology, we haven't talked much about reptiles because there aren't many UK reptile species, but grass snakes, for example, other, I'm going to say, sort of vertebrates, larger animals that come and use ponds. How might we, you know, say a grass snake, how might we attract or support a grass snake using a pond? Any advice, Chloe?
Yeah, so grass snakes will hunt in water, and they'll eat a variety of things swimming in the water column, including things like tadpoles and fish. But if you can provide them with kind of basking areas also close to the pond, but areas where they can also hide and you know, be safe from other predators and things like that. So like we said earlier, a really good variety of habitats surrounding your pond, and yeah, they will swim in lots of areas in your pond. They're fantastic to see, and grass snakes are not dangerous. They are very, very timid, so if you have one around your pond, it's fantastic, and if you approach your pond, it will probably exit fairly swiftly and find some cover to hide in. They are not venomous at all. They will leave rather than be anywhere near you. They will play dead instead of you know, doing any kind of biting or anything like that. So yeah, grass snakes are fab to have around the pond. Yeah, provide a variety of cover, and they will hopefully come if you've got good habitat connecting to your garden. Awesome,
cool. Okay, so we've started talking about wider sort of pond ecology. I've seen a number of questions coming in about the mortal enemy, the heron. So shall we just start with that? Is that sort of myth or reality? Will a heron come along and just butcher an entire pond? Kes, do you have any experience of Stabby McStabface, as they're occasionally known?
I think if you've got a lot of habitat for things to hide in, then you can see herons as a cool occasional visitor. They're going to take stuff, but if you've got enough complexity in your habitat, enough hiding places for different things, I don't know, I like herons, so maybe I'm not the person to answer this question. I could, maybe Emily and Chloe with their frog love will be a bit more sad about the heron visitors.
Yeah. Anyone not team heron?
Well, no, so I'm just team wildlife, as a caveat there. Like Kes says, occasional visitor, complex pond, fantastic. If you do want to put a fake heron there as a deterrent, they basically don't like hunting in pairs. They like hunting in a solitary fashion. So if there is a fake heron there, they'll go, oh no, don't want to hunt with you, sorry, and will be less likely to land by your pond. But obviously we do want to make sure that the herons also have a bit of food to eat. So yeah, good to be supporting lots of things, but you don't necessarily want them visiting every day.
Yeah, and while you're on the subject, Chloe, what about domestic animals, cats and dogs and things like that? Will they hunt in a pond?
They're not going to really hunt in a pond. They would hunt around a pond. So that's, again, making sure you've got enough shelter. Do you have an animal that hunts in a pond?
Well, my dog's a bit of a madhead, so we'll probably be in there.
Probably
given half a chance, yes.
What I would say is some people think, oh no, I can't put a pond in because I have a cat or something like that. There are lots of, we have an abundance of cats in every single you know, local area that you could possibly be in. So if you limited, you know, your creation of a watery space in your garden because of yourself having a cat, you know, if you didn't have a cat, another one would just come in from next door and try and grab your frogs. So don't think of pets as a barrier to putting in something like a pond, but just think about where they might hunt. And like, I can't remember who said it earlier, was it Kes? Or I can't remember, you know, put yourself in the eyes of the predator. If you think of yourself as a cat and you can't get into that log pile, or you find it difficult to see in that long grass, then that prey species will be a lot safer.
Yeah. Okie dokie. Another common question is, can newts and frogs cohabit? will they predate each other's eggs? Emily, is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, so there is a bit of a cycle that occurs here. So newts will consume a little bit of frog spawn within a pond. Male newts go through an elaborate courtship. They do lots of dancing and are very active in spring. And of course, there's free protein, free eggs at the top that they'll nip at whilst they're dancing. Frogs not at all bothered by newt eggs at all. So you won't get that happen. But what will happen is if the newts get lots and lots of feed, their population boom, so there's a large number of them within your pond. Over a few years, they'll disperse a bit to find their own space, and then the frogs will come back and there'll be a natural balance. So don't worry too much about having both of them. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, I sort of sometimes we sort of start thinking about ponds as being quite a peace and love type environment, but actually they're really, really fractious. Kes, maybe do you want to take us through some of your biggest aquatic nightmares, the real hooligans of the pond world that you might be able to see in action?
Well, we've mentioned the dragonfly larvae before, and they are really one of the top predators of the creepy crawly section, but also as Emily and I think Chloe have both mentioned, you know, they will go after frog spawn, tadpoles. They're really ferocious. Your fingers if you get too close. So they're really the king of the castle when it comes to pond wildlife. And you know, we often think of these beautiful dragonflies flitting around, but they are very voracious predators, and they're quite, I think they're pretty cool looking when they're in their larval form, but they are a bit scary looking as well if you're not too sure. But there's a whole host of very interesting interactions going on from a very, very tiny level going up bigger and bigger and bigger around your ponds. Like we've mentioned that other bigger wildlife will come, like herons, really, I think, are really cool, badgers and all sorts of things will come and drink from your pond as well. So ponds are like an oasis for land animals, but for the things that live in the pond and interact in the pond, they are really volatile areas. There's all sorts of mating and fighting and all sorts of things going on between all different levels and all different kinds of animals.
Cool, and we'll pick up a bit on how you can sort of actually get closer and see some of these things. Where do we stand on fish, Chloe? Will fish eat frog spawn? Can fish and frogs coexist?
If you are going to have a wildlife pond, it is very much recommended that you do not put fish in the pond. They will eat a lot of the things that are, you know, wildlife in your pond. They will eat amphibians, they will eat invertebrates within the water column, which means that, you know, all of your amphibians will have less to feed on. So generally it's better not to have fish. Even when you think you can have really tiny fish, they will still predate a lot of the things within your wildlife pond, making it very much dominated by fish and not by wildlife.
Right, and no species that are any more pond friendly, or is it pretty much a blanket no? Emily's
Well, I
shaking
can add
her
to
head
that.
there.
UCL have done some really interesting research on the Crucian carp, which is a native pond species, and they found that if you've got a complicated habitat and stuff, Crucian carp won't go too much for frog spawn and things, so you can have a cohabiting with certain species. I would go with Chloe, like really recommend against having any fish in your wildlife pond. And if you really had to, have a look at native species, like everyone goes koi or goldfish or something, and they're just not as native and cool as some of our native species of fish like roach and rudd and things. You need a bigger pond for those species because they get bigger, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm hearing wildlife pond or fish pond, but don't try and do both. Now, I think I've done something to offend Alice, because she's given me a pop question on the reintroduction of the Aesculapian snake to the UK. Aesculapian, right. I'm not sure what I've done to her to have been fed that word, but good or bad thing? Pop quiz, Emily.
No, not necessary. So there are two populations of Aesculapian snake in the UK. One is in my patch in London and one is in Wales. Yeah, we don't need to focus efforts on reintroductions for sure. We have plenty native species that need help, like the lovely and stunning adder that's in decline across the UK. Certainly needs more conservation effort, pushed into that rather than reintroducing anything. That's certainly my opinion.
Cool, thank you. I think she's forgiven me. Ducks, Chloe.
That's quite abrupt. Ducks.
Ducks.
You know what? I don't know.
No? Anyone got a view on ducks?
Take on ducks.
Are we talking wild ducks or your own pet ducks?
Well, just will they affect pond populations, amphibians, etc.?
So ducks, I mean, waterfowl in general, I would say are very inquisitive, as with most birds of, they see anything, they'll give it a peck, regardless if it's a plant or an animal. They're not great for them. I mean, our London office is actually based on a community farm, and there's a variety of different wildlife ponds, and then there is one single duck pond, which of course all of our common frogs want to live in. We find on many mornings many pecked common frogs, so ideally not, but yeah, in a wild or bigger setting, there's probably more than enough space for both of them.
Okay.
From a chemistry perspective, the extra poo isn't always needed, especially if you've got a smaller pond. But not much you can do about wild things. They will come pretty much. If they want to, they'll come there.
Right, noted, and thank you again, Kes, for finding our level there. All right, we've got 15 minutes left in our slot. Conscious that there is still a little bit more. I want to talk some really headline stuff about pond maintenance. I think we talked a bit about clearing plants and animal and algae rather. Maybe, Kes, very broad question. What do I look for in a healthy pond?
So I guess lots of different species doing well. Like if your plants are all looking healthy and happy and you've got a good mix of different plant species and they're all growing really well, that's a great sign. People tend to get very hung up on the colour of the pond water, but all sorts of things can change your pond water colour. From if there's leaves in the bottom, there can be tannins, much like in a cup of tea, that make it go kind of browny colour. You can have some algae that are growing in the water that are not necessarily bad unless they get completely out of control. So for me, it's all about ponds and how much wildlife you've got there. If you've got like tons and tons of variety of life, that's a really healthy pond to me. So if you do some pond dipping and you pull up tons of creatures, that's a good sign.
Cool. We'll come back to pond dipping in a second. Chloe, any real basics? Again, maybe give us your top three essentials for pond maintenance.
So I would go for think about the time of year that you are going to do any maintenance to your pond. So obviously you don't want to start doing loads of stuff now when you've got amphibians laying eggs. So think about doing your maintenance in autumn and winter so that you're ready for the next spring. A couple of other top ones. That's kind of my headline one. Emily, have you got any others?
Yeah, just to add, yeah, exactly that kind of season, and anything you do pull out, just leave at the pond edge to allow any critters to get back in, kind of what Kes was saying earlier on. As another sort of big one for that. And I suppose the third one, which is always the thing where people get quite cautious, if the plants have really taken over, don't be afraid to cut them back. They're very resilient, they will grow again. Yeah, don't be afraid to get stuck in.
Okie dokie. And maybe while you're on, Emily, a couple of questions around I think for smaller ponds, should they be emptied in winter? Do they need to be cleaned? And if so, how? I think we are definitely talking around the mini pond line here. Anything on emptying and cleaning?
You don't really need to clean a pond per se. The sort of emptying it, again, you can leave the water in there all through winter time. Just remove any sort of excess leaf litter or any debris, anything at the bottom that could start to decay, really. So all of this sort of dead material at the bottom, if you can sort of fish any of that out, and again, just pop it at the side for the winter time, that will do it for you. The only thing I'll just add there, that if there's anything overwintering in the pond, if you see lots of, let's say, baby newts and newt larvae, do halter your management. Just leave them be because they may be overwintering in that space.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And okay, so we've made our pond, we're managing it, we've got a lovely, thriving and diverse pond in our space. How do we enjoy it? How do we get up close and personal with it? How do we find out what's living in it? And and really get that deeper level of understanding. Now, slightly leading question, Kes, because I know you did a great video for us on pond dipping last year during the first lockdown. We've had a few people asking questions that, does this have to be a very expensive process? What's my basic kit for finding out and exploring and understanding what's living in my pond?
Yeah, so for a kit, you just want some kind of pond net. You can go super expensive on that. I think my pond net is a professional pond net and it was nearly £100, but you can get a cheap pond net and it will work, not, you know, obviously not as well, but it will work pretty good for seeing what's in your pond. Then you want something like a light coloured a white tray is best, so whether that's a washing up bowl, a bucket, some kind of lid, that's going to be the easiest in terms of what, so you can actually look and clearly see what's going on and living in there. Other things you might want, I mean, I usually use some sort of like just a teaspoon or something to move things around. Some of those little tiny creepy crawlies that you get in your pond can be quite delicate and they can have kind of gills and stuff, so you don't want to be too hands-on with stuff, and you can kind of just move them around and have a look. If you've got a hand lens or something to look, that can be handy. There's a couple of things to be aware of. One are back swimmers. They are you might, or I think they're known to neck today, which is a scientific name. I never remember what the common name is. Maybe it's pond boatman or something, but they swim around in the water and they can sting, so it's worth not putting your fingers too close to them. They'll also, if you've got them in your pond sample, they'll sometimes come up to the top like this, and then they'll suddenly take off, which is quite exciting and fun to see. That's really fun when you're pond dipping. And the other thing, I have been got a couple of times by dragonfly larvae, but it's no skin breaking or anything. So just to be mindful of little ones' fingers, because it can be quite a scarring experience for small children if they get. But yeah, have a poke around, use whatever you like, teaspoons, tweezers, be just really gentle and careful with whatever's in there. You don't want
most of these creatures big enough to be seen with the naked eye, or should I be spending a bit of money on magnification? Maybe Chloe, do you want to pick up the baton?
Yeah, so you can see a lot of things with the naked eye, like Kes says. If you can, you know, put a spoon underneath them and lift it up slightly, you can kind of keep them still but in water. It's useful to be able to then identify things. So you can get, you know, books on pond identification, but the FSC fold out guides, they've got a specific one for kind of pond dipping stuff. That's really, really useful. And it will help you identify, you know, 99% of the things that you can find in your pond that you'll get with a kind of standard kind of pond dipping net.
Brilliant. Emily, anything to add on your domestic pond dipping kit?
No, that's exactly it. And just as Kes said, be mindful of some of them things that can nip. I think I've been nipped by everything in the pond possible. So any little fingers, yeah, be cautious.
Are we getting our
and make sure
to
wash your hands afterwards, because there can be some nasties in ponds, so make sure you wash your hands afterwards. And I would say when you're doing the pond dipping as well, remember what we've been talking about different habitats, because different things will live in the different parts of your ponds. There'll be some things in that kind of plants by the side, there'll be some things quite deep at the bottom, so have a poke around and see what different things you find in the different areas.
Cool. Okie dokie. And yeah, I was going to assume that your white tray that you use for this shouldn't be something you routinely use for food preparation, maybe.
Yeah, not the best. Maybe something special just for pond dipping. You could even like a cat litter tray or something like that. A clean one. Please use a clean one. But you know.
No.
But if you don't have a white tray or a washing up bowl and you don't want to buy something, I know that lots of people have been getting takeaways during lockdowns. You could use a takeaway tub and put a white piece of paper underneath it, so that you've then got contrast with the thing, you know, with the ground, if you don't want to, you know, buy yourself a special thing if you're just going to do a kind of one-off. But yeah, like you say, then maybe don't eat out of it.
Good tip.
There we go.
I'll quickly add to that as well that pond dipping in your own garden with all your equipment is great, but if you're going out to a park or somewhere else, please make sure that you've properly washed all of the equipment you've got from that when you're going to that place. So you can use different disinfectants and things like that. You just don't want to again spread any disease.
And dry, clean, check and dry is the mantra that we repeat over and over again. Make sure there's no plant fragments or anything like that. Clean and make sure it's dry, because most things can't survive being dried out.
Yeah,
clean, check and dry.
Yeah, that's not just on your pond kit, that's also on your boots as well. If you're wearing wellies and you're going to multiple ponds, it's really good to have a regimented cleaning process on those as well.
Okay, groovy, thank you. 2 final questions. Emily, is there ever a bad time of year to build a pond?
No, building ponds all 12 months of the year. Go ahead, because you're not disturbing any breeding habitat or anything like that at that point. For restoring a pond, let's say you've got one it's a bit tired, wait till about autumn before you start off on that one. But yeah. Okay,
and we've had another query. Garden on a hill, and ponds in the top, the middle, or the bottom? Frogs throughout. Is there a particular place where you'd position your pond?
So it's a good question, that. Generally, we'd say towards the bottom of the slope. But again, it's going to
water flows downhill, really. So
exactly
there's a logic behind that. Yeah.
It'll keep it damper. The only time you might not do that is if it's incredibly shaded in that area and you just need a bit more light. But yeah, bottom of the hill.
Brilliant. Okie dokie. Well, that I think is taking us pretty much to time. I hope even in an hour and a half, it seems like it's been a frantic rush around the subject matter. So I hope we've captured most of the questions that you've been putting in. And yeah, we will be following this up with an email, which is going to have all the useful links, and there'll be the recording of this full session made available on our social. So thank you all very much for coming. There's still 115 of you left in the session, which is fantastic for 8:30 on a school night. So really thanks. It's you guys and your contributions and your questions that make these sessions what they are. So thank you for that. Thank you very much to Kes, to Chloe, and to Emily for coming along and giving of their wisdom and their experience. I know we're all at home and none of us can hear any of you, but on behalf of everyone, thank you very much to our lovely panelists.
Thank you, Ben, too, for moderating so well. That was awesome. Really good.
Well,
and in such smart attire.
Well, there we go. Relatedly to that, thank you also to the unsung and unseen heroes, James and Alice, who are behind the scenes and doing all the hard work and the logistics of getting this event together and making sure that it's all captured. So, and yeah, just a reminder that both Froglife and Earthwatch Europe are charities. If you've enjoyed this session and are moved to help support our work, then you can find out how to contribute to our work through both our websites. So that's it from us. Thank you very much to everyone concerned. Alice is going to end the session. We'll have another one of these in a couple of months. Do stay tuned to our Facebook page and websites and find out what's coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much. Bye.